The landscapes of California and the histories embedded in them are something that are endlessly compelling to me, and you know that from watching these videos. But this is a place that really brings that truth home. I'm in San Bruno, California. I'm on the El Camino Real at the corner of Seabiscuit Drive. I'm at the entrance to the shops at Tanforan. It's a gray, south of San Francisco afternoon. Behind me now in the distance is San Bruno Mountain, and in front of it the hill in South San Francisco that says the Industrial City, welcoming visitors to the region from San Francisco International Airport, which is just behind the mall here. Why am I here? What history lurks in this place? Well, in 1942, in April, the Tanforan racetrack, which occupied this site, became the first stop in the internment of Japanese Americans in the Bay Area, with the arrival of the first busloads of Japanese families from all around the Bay region. By the end of April, about 8,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans were incarcerated here in the makeshift barracks and in the horse stables and existing grandstands and other facilities of the racetrack. And they stayed here for the first 6 months of their experience before they were relocated deep into the Utah desert, for most of them, to Topaz in Utah. There's very little in the landscape of this place that tells us about that moment in time. In fact, the developers of the shops at Tanforan haven't made it any easier. It turns out that the racehorse, Seabiscuit, which in the 1930s became a famous racehorse in the United States, a great underdog, a misshapen small horse that took on all comers and defeated even some of the greatest Eastern racehorses of the time. Seabiscuit was the great underdog of Depression-era horse racing, a symbol for Depression-era America. And Seabiscuit lived and raced here a few times in 1939, and that seemed for the developers a good symbol for the mall, certainly something easier to sell shoes and books and bedroom cabinets with than the story of Japanese internment. But we know that Japanese American families who were interned here at Tanforan began to make new lives and demonstrate the kind of resiliency that we see in other stories of Japanese internment. We know from the photographs taken by Dorothea Lange and others, and the memoirs and the memories of those people who were interned, that the story of resilience is also a critical part of the tale of Japanese internment. The families who arrived here in April of 1942 almost immediately began trying to restore and reestablish some semblance of normal life. School teachers and college professors who were interned here as somehow a danger to America immediately began to set up schools for the children, schools for high school students to make it possible for them to receive their diplomas at San Bruno High School, at Sequoia High School, Woodside High School, and high schools throughout the San Francisco region. They also set up a whole system of adult education classes. Famous artists were interned here, and they set up art classes for adults to give them something to do. In addition, Japanese Americans immediately began to try to organize politically, to set up and elect a camp council, to elect camp leaders for each of the housing blocks, to address critical issues and needs of the interned families who were here. They appealed to the camp director at the time to help set up such a democratic process. And within a month of having arrived here and living in the dirt stables where horses had recently been removed, they had begun to set up examples of small local democracy. In addition to these activities, Japanese American residents at Tanforan organized a daily newspaper. They put together a recreational program, including sports teams from sumo to baseball. They organized religious services so that Protestants, Catholics, Seventh-day Adventists, and Buddhists all had separate ceremonies operating here within just a few weeks of camp having begun operations. All of these things they did to maintain a semblance of ordinary life in the context that was completely unordinary, to give meaning to lives that had been interrupted, so that they weren't simply waiting, but that they were active and were engaged and were steering their lives forward with some kind of agency in a context in which they were not free and had very little control. One final illustration of that level of organization and community spiritedness that can be seen here is the Remembrance Garden, which is just behind me, built in 2007 with donations from the Bay Area's Japanese American community. They included a plaque which reads, "The Tanforan Assembly Center, Commemorative Garden. This garden memorializes the time when this site, then the Tanforan Park Racetrack, was transformed into a temporary assembly center for persons of Japanese ancestry. May we honor this period of history by our remembrance and just action." And that's a good memento for us as well, to recall that even our landscapes in California that are as mundane as the shopping mall often contain a deeper history of meaning and memory that waits for us, really, to explore and to dig it out. So here I am, the shops at Tanforan, the Tanforan Assembly Center in San Bruno, California, and one story of Japanese internment during World War II.